Master Sergeant John DeSaume on the tenor sax. John DeSaume. Staff Sergeant Reagan Bruff on the composition.
Welcome to Clark Center NYC's program this evening, Focus on Ted Berger, who has been a dear friend to Clark Center for decades. I'm Jill Williams, the director of Clark Center NYC. And for those of you joining us for the very first time, allow me to give you a very brief introduction to our organization. Little over 10 years ago, a group of Clark Center alum, realizing that our history was disappearing, created Clark Center NYC, dedicated to preserving the history and legacy of Clark Center for the Performing Arts through panels, performances, a website, dance classes, parties, e-blasts, and even an art exhibition. More recently, we began producing online events. And really the question is, what do we learn from our past as we continue to explore? Dating back to the late 1950s, Clark Center had a preeminent faculty of instructors, an extensive scholarship program, and a philosophy of accessibility for everyone. Clark Center provided an environment that produced dancers, teachers, musicians, choreographers with far-reaching influence on the dance world. Students were given the opportunity to perform in Clark Center dance companies and to hone their skills as choreographers in concerts produced by Clark Center. From the first director, Adele Holtz, who saw something special in Alvin Ailey, and invited him to start a program at the 50th Street YWCA. To our last amazing director, Louise Roberts, who nurtured all of us. Clark Center shared a vision that I believe Ted Berger does as well, that the arts on all levels are for all of us. Over these last 10 years, Clark Center NYC has held events at the 92nd Street Y, the Schomburg, the Performing Arts Library, Summer Stage, El Barrio's Art Space, and even Aaron Davis Hall at City College, where Ted joined the cast of Clark Center from the horse's mouth, where he shared his memories and even danced across the stage. Perhaps Ted can share his early encounter with Clark Center when, as a college student, he had a play produced there. Later, as an arts advocate, he became friends with Louise Roberts. And when Clark Center became the victim of gentrification, and Louise literally gave up trying to save Clark Center, Ted provided her office space at the New York Foundation for the Arts to work on the Clark Center archives with Joni Channon. Years later, Ted helped to guide the Clark Center NYC board in crafting our mission and goals. Like us, he understood the importance of the special place that Clark Center was. Later, we honored Ted in around 2018 for his guidance and friendship. For this evening, we welcome Carol Fineberg, a very good friend of Ted's, who has been involved in every aspect of arts education. As an arts teacher, history teacher, evaluator, grant maker, grant writer, researcher, independent scholar, published author, project inventor, bureaucrat, independent consultant, designer of innovative programs for schools and school districts, arts organizations, independent artists, and an all-around gadfly. She's one of us. Carol's clients have included foundation, arts organization, school districts, and potential individual philanthropists. Carol has served in the field for over 50 years, and she's still working. In a moment, Carol will begin in a conversation with Ted. There'll be some time at the end of the program for you to ask questions, but in the meantime, we ask that you remain muted. And I welcome Carol and thank you for joining this evening. How to briefly introduce Ted Berger. This is the 50th year Ted Berger has been in the nonprofit arts and cultural sector. He's the executive director emeritus of the New York Foundation for the Arts, where he began in 1973 as the country's first statewide arts and school coordinator, becoming the executive director in 1980, retiring in 2005. Ted has been involved in helping to create many national and local initiatives, including such efforts as the Arts Connection, Studio in a School, New York City Seed Artist Project, the Montauk and Orcas Conference for Support of Individual Artists, ArtsWire, the National Campaign for Freedom of Expression, the Cultural Blueprint for New York City, the Urban Arts Initiative in New York City, and the New York City Recovery Arts Fund after 9/11. But most important, Ted has been a vocal advocate for the arts and arts organizations, speaking out on issues such as the needs of individual artists, the importance of art funding, and the need for arts organization and lifelong learning in the arts, and responsibilities and responsiveness to equity, diversity, and inclusion. In his work with the development of numerous arts and cultural advocacy organizations, Ted often focuses on the centrality of the living artist to the arts and society. He is a trustee emeritus of the Joni Mitchell Foundation, where he also served as treasurer. It's our honor to welcome you this evening, Ted. Thank you.
Okay, is that my cue?
Yes.
I think so many of you know particular parts of TED, that this is an opportunity for us to sort of walk down memory lane together and start putting some of those parts together into a pattern of achievement and influence and fun that can only advance everyone's understanding and appreciation of you.
Thank you, Carol.
So we will talk about a number of things. I'm going to ask a few questions to start the ball rolling, but really it is a conversation, and I'll be here listening as well as our friends out in the audience. To start and at the almost beginning, it occurred to me that people might be interested in knowing who were the people who influenced you as you moved from that precocious little boy that I know you must have been to a very active young man in both academia and the arts. Where did it start and who got you going?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming. And I want to thank Clark Center in New York enormously for this opportunity to talk. And I want to thank Carol. We've been buddies for close to 50 years.
How long?
And so it's a pleasure to really just talk with you. I warn you, and I've warned Carol and Jill, I don't do TED Talks. TED Talks are tightly crafted efforts. I do TED films at the mouth. At this point in my life, I don't have an institutional base I have to protect. I don't care if people call me an old coot. I'm ready to say things that other people may be thinking but are afraid to say. And so I urge you to use the hook to shut me up because the foaming keeps going.
Yeah, we'll just help you breathe.
As far as influences go, it's really hard to say. I mean, my parents were extraordinarily supportive of me. I was an only child. We were very middle class, maybe lower middle class. I didn't get a lot of arts at home, but I was encouraged, and a lot of it came through schools. And there were teachers who saw something there. And that was true in the elementary school and junior high school, and in high school in particular. There was one teacher who taught theater, and Marion Strauss, and she was a big influence. I was from Providence, Rhode Island, and Providence was a small town, and I was anxious to get out of Providence, even though Brown was going to be my buffer school. Whoever was the highest bidder would get me. And Dartmouth was extraordinarily generous and supported me through 4 years, and even supported me to go to graduate school. And it was probably in college that I had teachers who were a great influence on me. I thought I was going to teach English comparative literature, but I was especially interested in theater, and I was going to teach dramatic literature. And I was headed for a PhD. I went to Columbia, and it was the heyday of Columbia's English department.
What decade was this? Just to put it into some chronology.
This was I graduated college 1962, so it was 1962.
So it was as things were really
Right.
changing rapidly.
Right. But the English department at Columbia was extraordinary. I mean, it was filled with legends like Lionel Trilling, Eric Bentley. And I was studying dramatic literature with Bob Brustein.
Mhm.
And what was interesting about, I was in New York, and I was like a pig in mud. You know, I didn't have much money and would save money to go to things, to particularly theater. And I learned how to do second acts like many of us do, and was seeing a lot of stuff. And what we found in our seminar, people who were interested in theater were divided. People who saw it as literature, and then some of us, like me, saw it as show business. And I was studying for my comps, and I was extremely well prepared from undergraduate, and was kind of bored. And there was another guy in my seminar, Mel Marvin, who was a composer, and we said, "Oh, we should do something. We're both bored," and we started to write a musical. And about 59 years ago, I remember it vividly, Asya, because the rehearsal of a show that we wrote opened on the morning after we were married.
Wow.
Mel and I wrote a musical called Shoemaker's Holiday, and it was based on an Elizabethan play by Thomas Dekker. And Mel heard that there was a theater at Barnet called the Minor Latham Playhouse. And its claim to fame is where the Fantastics had started when it was a one-act musical. And they had never done another musical since then, and they had an open call. And lo and behold, we were selected. And it was a huge success that summer. And it triggered things that said, do you really want a PhD? Is this what you want to do with your life? The English department thought I was crazy because I was a good student, and they want to keep me around. And also, it was a time when I was trying to figure out what to do about the draft. And the English department helped me get a job at Columbia, where I was giving student loans. With it came an occupational deferment. I had some money coming in. We'd been married, and I was working on this show. And this show had started to have a life. Subsequently, it went off Broadway and bombed. If you get me drunk enough, I'll tell you all the stories.
Meanwhile, you became part of the ruling class when you became a dean, did you not?
Well, yes. No, but I was a baby dean.
Yeah.
I was then one of the youngest deans Columbia had ever had. But I still had this kind of show business, theater stuff in my bones. And and then the 68 riots happened at Columbia, which had a seminal influence on me.
And I suspect on some of the people in our group tonight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because I had started out giving student loans, I was very close to many of students on campus, and many of whom, because I was young, they would really talk to me about what was going on. And in 68, when the police invaded the campus, having been called by the president, there was a day after the bust where there was a line of policemen in front of me and a line of policemen in back of me. And my job that day was checking faculty IDs at the gate, because it was a meeting of the whole faculty on campus. But students who had been bloodied the night before were all the way down from the Columbia gates of 116th Street all the way down to Riverside Drive. And many of them were friends. And I still sometimes have nightmares about that day. But it's been a metaphor for this gatekeeping role that I've played in my life, which I both like and haunts me at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I think the strand of caring beyond your pay grade is a strong one that has persisted all the way through your career. You're standing up for individual artists, if we can leap over some decades, has made a huge difference in our community of artists and those who love them. You want to talk about that a little
Well,
bit?
I mean, yes, because in a sense it continues the story. After the bust, I quit Columbia, didn't quite know what I was going to do. I started to work on another show, and I realized I was pretty good. I wasn't good enough, and I didn't believe in myself enough as an artist, and I didn't have a trust fund. And I was trying to figure out what to do. We didn't have a kid then, and Asi had a fellowship, and I literally quit an enormously successful career. Not quite knowing what to do, we were at a party, and somebody said to me, "You would be perfect for arts administration." And I said, "What's that?"
Yeah.
And it was a time when this field was getting born. And they told me about a job that was open at the New York Foundation for the Arts. And when I was hired to run the Artists in Schools program, and then in that, I started to deal with the role artists can play in education, in community, what the struggles are, with which I certainly identified. And then when I became executive director, we took on the Artist Fellowship Program for the state. And I had colleagues like Penny, you saw her picture, without whom I couldn't have survived, that built our whole effort. But I kept saying, yes, we're giving money away, but what about all those people who are applying? What are we doing for them?
Yeah, let's stop there for a second, because we're trying to beat the clock, and this position that you took as the guru of artists in residence, as we called them in those days, was a position where you advocated for something that was brand new.
Yes.
And it married the need for a payday with a need to be creative and a need to serve the community. Talk about that.
Well, it also came at a really interesting moment. I started with the Artists in Schools program when New York City was in fiscal ruin. Overnight, all art teachers and music teachers had been excised
From the elementary
from the
schools.
elementary school. And I came along saying, wouldn't you like to have an artist in the school? And, you know, that didn't go over well. So we had to figure out what did that really mean in terms of education. And then I got involved shortly after that with New York City was, the country was in economic challenge, was facing economic challenges. And there was a program that developed called the CEDA program, the Comprehensive Employment Training Act program. And I was fortunate to work with a group of colleagues and became one of the architects of the New York City project, which was then the largest artist employment program since WPA. And so the idea of how artists work in a larger community setting or educational setting and can earn money from that has been a constant. But one of the issues for me is the economic fragility of our field, both for arts organizations, large and small, as well as, and certainly for individual artists and other cultural workers. Yeah. And that's been a through line in my work.
Well, what was interesting about that was that you were talking to educators and trying to convince them that there was value in having artists in the school. And you were also talking to the artists, many of whom didn't have wonderful experiences in schools, to say the least, and talking them into finding a way to make a lifetime connection with the creative world. And you succeeded.
I don't know if I succeeded. There's a lot of work that has to be done.
Yeah,
I
but with that
helped to
generation.
start some work. I was really fortunate along the way, at least as far as the education stuff went. I was involved with helping to bring an extraordinary organization, Arts Connection, into being, and then helping Aggie Gunn develop Studio in the School. I remember something that was once told to me. I was on some site visit or something, and I was talking to the head of the Minneapolis Children's Theater, and he said, you know, you never know what's going to happen. A kid can be exposed 1,000 times and nothing happens. And then suddenly one day, in a second, his or her life changes.
The light goes on.
And when that light goes on, that's the work. It isn't about turning people into artists. It's been about how do you create a society where they think they are creative human beings and they value what professional creative human beings do. It's a rare gift if you're part of helping bring that world into being. And that it was said earlier that this isn't for some people, it's for all people.
Yeah, and when you look back now on that pioneering work that was done, and see how our whole educational system now nationally takes for granted that artists have a place in the schools, for the most part. Not everybody.
I mean,
But it's not like asking Martians.
No. But there's still there's still an enormous amount of advocacy that is critical for this sector, both to survive and grow. There was my generation of administrators helped to build more of an infrastructure that wasn't there. And we laid some groundwork. We had some successes, a lot of failures, but I'm proud of a lot of that work. But it's really the first stage of making people much more aware that there is a creative sector that's there to help the way other people can help.
It was also a good time for young artists who were just establishing themselves to make enough money to continue their studies and to find themselves on Broadway stages, for example.
This was an extraordinary moment. I came into this field when it was being born. I really met Nancy Hanks, the first chair of the National Endowment for the Arts. I may be old. I'm not as old as Methuselah, but you know, I've been around at least 50 years.
You're not as old as I am.
And what was interesting is that there was the spirit of the 60s was still there.
Yeah.
And so it was a time when public money started to grow, programs like Artists in Schools started to grow, and new voices had an opportunity to come to surface, particularly artists of color, women, people with disability. It was a whole new way of looking at this. And so an emerging artist, well, I hate that term, had an opportunity to get some recognition financially, and then she or he could begin to shape some sort of living out of that and figure out a creative life from that.
Right. Let's skip a little bit to some of the other battles that you were involved in that helped forge the future, just as the Artists in Schools program helped to forge many of the subsequent programs.
I mean, I often think the word arts is misspelled. I think it should be crisis. I think there have been constant battles ever since I came into this field.
Every time I get a solicitation saying the arts are endangered, I know that the budget is being created for next year. It's a yearly a yearly crisis.
I mean, this is a young country, relatively speaking, and in many parts of the world, even some of the poorest countries, support their arts organizations and artists far better than we do.
Why?
Because it's been around longer. You know, this is a new country, and there was a Puritan ethic about its founding, so that all this stuff was somehow sinful. Do you remember a book, Coming to Our Senses, by David Rockefeller Jr.?
Right.
But it talks about the Puritan background here. So we've done some baseline work in getting it going, but the battles are constant because they are, if artists are the truth sayers and the celebrants of our lives, and they hold a mirror up to what's going on in society, they sometimes make people uncomfortable. So whether it's and as a result, it's a wedge issue that other political forces can use to make their point. So one of the battles was the first of the culture wars, which we're dealing with. The battle of equity has been there from the beginning. The arts have historically been seen as a class issue and a white person's issue.
Right.
It's only relatively recently that we're beginning to see some changes about thinking about that.
Yeah, there's a
Okay.
self-consciousness now about how one defines the field
Well,
of
it's
the arts.
whose
and
culture
for
is it?
whom, exactly.
Right, whose art is this? What was interesting about the generation of administrators that I was part of, that spirit of the 60s was still there. And people were fighting for the same rights that people were fighting for in the 60s, whether they were gender issues, whether they were race issues, civil rights issues, etc. And I think this, as we all know, there's plenty of work that still needs to be done.
Yeah.
One of the increasing issues is any crisis reveals the fault lines that exist in one's personal life or in the systems. So the increase of disasters, whether natural disasters, such as happened
Right.
with Katrina and Rita, or happens with civil unrest, etc., means that the economic fragility of our field is revealed all too quickly.
Yeah.
There are very few cushions that organizations, even big ones, have that can survive for a long time. The artists are still dealing with an economic fragility, the episodic income that has to change.
And that leads me to ask you to give some of your observations about the evolution of the philanthropic community, both in New York and nationally, to support or to defund with equal abandon sometimes what's going on in the creative fields.
One of the unique things about being at NYPA was I had to raise money in order to give it away. We were a public charity. And so I kind of understood the issues of how are you responsible and responsive from both perspectives. I think philanthropy has come a long way. However,
By what measure?
well, they're dealing with some of the issues that public funders have had to deal with from the very beginning.
Like what?
Access issues. Who gets money? Okay. As the field has become bigger and more diverse, how is private philanthropy responding to the breadth of that field? It can't always be support of the historic treasures, cultural treasures of the world. Okay? The 5% cap, which many philanthropic sources use,
Is gratuitous.
is gratuitous.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So philanthropy is growing. There's also a generational change that's happening, which is both good and scary.
What about the recognition of people who have been there with cup in hand, who were ignored during the heyday of some of the
People are very
philanthropic
angry.
work? Yeah,
They're very, very angry,
and you
and
sometimes
they're
get involved in that.
and angry even about public money that has ignored them. Yes, I mean, that's often been organizations and artists of color. It's not, and women.
And gender issues.
You know, a lot of people here have been involved in those
Exactly.
fights, and that work continues. You know, the work goes on.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the lessons we've learned from our many decades on this earth, which is that the work does have to go on and sometimes be repeated from point zero to get to where we were 10 years ago.
Right.
And then to kick it aside and go into new territory. When you look through your magic globe at what's possible in the future, what do you see in terms of new changes, the role of technology in our work and so forth?
I had a colleague whom I adored, Ella King Torrey, who used to call me the Cassandra of the arts community. And I want to be hopeful.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Do you see new forces?
I see new energy. Yeah. And I think there are a lot of people coming into this field that really want to stay and build something. I think what's happened is that sense that my generation had of the possibility of building something new, something different, is often not there on the part of administrators. It's always there with artists, and that's what they're about. I do feel that there's a kind of re-examining of the systems that my generation was part of setting up.
Mhm, mhm.
There's the theory about the three-legged stool that this sector depends upon: earned income, contributed income, and public funds. And that stool is very, very wobbly.
Yeah, and if one of the legs falls, the whole stool
Okay,
falls.
and the increase of disasters like COVID has simply exacerbated many of the problems that were there. So there's a re-examining that is happening that could be, I'm seeing signs of enormous thinking about this, particularly on the part of individual artists. I've been privileged to be part of an initiative called Creatives Rebuild New York, which was spearheaded by the Mellon Foundation. I've been part of a think tank there. And they've been looking at some really interesting ideas about jobs for artists, modeled on what happened with CETA, but also looking at the issue of guaranteed income.
Mm,
And as society is going to have more gig workers in the future, the issue of how we are going to support our people, particularly when AI is displacing us all, is going to be a societal challenge. So what I'm hoping is that our sector, and this is where I do have hope, is going to be seen as a real force to deal with some of the bigger problems that are around. This is not about a field that is about pretty pictures on the wall. Many people perceive us that way. Some people are beginning to see us as the true force, economic force, labor force,
and profits.
and because of the way that a product can become part of the entertainment world, yes, real profits.
Yeah. This is a good time to remind everybody that we have set aside about 10 minutes for some questions and comments. The only caveat is that there are a lot of people who may want to express their own important and valuable ideas. So remember the rule of the world, which is brevity is next to godliness. And in that spirit, Jill, are you going to describe the process? We're going to thank Ted profusely in a few minutes, but now we're going to put him on the spot by asking you all out there in cyberspace what questions you would like to pose to our beloved Theodore.
Thank you, Carol. We have two options. You can either write something in the chat at the bottom of the screen, and we'll recognize that, or there's a little icon where you can raise your hand, and then we can call on you to do that. So, you ready for questions, Carol?
I think so.
Ted?
Don't all speak at once.
I have a
I
question.
see Carol Sterling has a question.
I have a question. So Ted, do you think it's appropriate for artists who work in our schools and our community settings to also teach the people that they work with strategies in arts advocacy? For example, how to encourage people to get involved in public policies that support artists? Do you think that's an appropriate?
I mean,
Good question.
it goes without saying. I'm not sure that's the job of the artist. I think there are organizations and others that can help people think through advocacy work. The need for advocacy is constant. I wish it weren't. It's needed on every level. At the local level, at the state level and at the federal level. And what's increasingly important, it cannot come from the vested interests of artists and arts organizations. It needs to come from people who benefit from it.
And if I might add, could you comment on advocating for what? It's one thing to have this great notion of.
Well, I mean, Carol's point about public policy is an important one, because I think a lot of people advocate only for money. Okay. And it goes beyond that. And people really need to study the issues, because what may be true in one community might not be true in other communities. Advocacy is a complicated issue. I've done a lot of it. And dealing with elected officials is important. And they keep changing. So you're constantly involved in the process of education. But we need, and for those of us who have been advocates for a long time, unless you feel that there's a younger generation coming along, it's scary, because this is a long distance fight for many of the battles that we are involved with, especially these days. Yeah. And let me while we have a moment, you know, the New York City is under a lot of pressure right now about the budget. The budget has not been passed. We are all very, very concerned about what's going to happen with the city budget regarding arts and culture, because there are enormous pressures on this administration to respond to everything. And we're an easy target to cut. So if you know elected officials, if you know the mayor, give them a call.
Step right up.
Yeah, we have a question in the chat about following up on what Ted said about the scarcity of funds, people kind of scrambling to get what they can. How do we bring diverse groups together to continue the fight?
Well, very important. One of the things that happened as a byproduct of COVID that I think has helped enormously is an effort called Culture at 3. And I've been privileged to be part of it. For 3 days a week, people in the arts community come together and just have conversation. It started as a self-help group, originally with the big institutions, and then gradually opened to everybody. And what it's done is broken some of the barriers that have historically existed about organizational size, borough disparity, discipline differences. And it is hard to herd cats. We all know that. But this has gone a long way. I was on a call today because the chickens are coming home to roost. All of the Band-Aids that have been put on trying to help our sector keep going during COVID, those Band-Aids are peeling off. You're probably reading about reductions at BAM, at the Public Theater. Theaters in Chicago are closing. The Mark Taper in LA is going to have next season. We got troubles right here in River City. Yeah. And we've got to, and today's call was very much, how do we approach this together? If you're really tiny, you'll survive. But if you become dependent on public funds, you could be in a mess if we don't get some of this money through. Very vulnerable.
Let's take one last question before we turn it back to Jill.
Another question that came through, is it possible for a place like Clark Center to exist in today's environment of a space for everyone to create, to be part of the arts community, whether they're professional or just amateurs?
I don't think you can ever lose the dream of that. I mean, to me, that's a vision that always has to exist. There are practical issues. The Midtown space that you had is unaffordable. And the dance community in particular is really struggling, performing arts as well, in general, with the cost of real estate. And that's happening not just in New York City, all over. So there are practical issues that could become impediments to that, but the vision and the possibility has to remain.
Ted, tangential to that, with so many businesses going out, all these empty storefronts, isn't there a possibility of creating a new partnership?
But one of the things I think that I often say that the moment we're in is like the 70s in New York again. The arts community rallied to keep things going. We did it with the schools. We did it in many different areas. I remember when Creative Time on 42nd Street did murals in empty stores and et cetera.
Yeah, and exhibitions.
We're part of we have the strength to help solve some of the problems. We just need to be strong enough in order to work to solve the problems.
And look for allies in odd places.
Exactly. And in communities, I think what's happening in neighborhoods where the arts have grown and are stronger than they ever were, there's a real understanding of what this community center, what this dance program means in my community. We've deepened our roots, but we have to really start to move into other areas so that we're part of the problem solving. We're still seen as this beautiful little toy, not as the force that we know we are, in my opinion.
Another question came in. Do we have time for one more question?
That's up to you, Jill.
Yes. Lorna Harris asked, how do we pass knowledge on to the next generation? So many have no idea of arts history in New York.
Lorna, my dear, thank you for joining. You're absolutely right. Unless we figure out how to pass this on, it's all going to be forgotten. We have, I mean, I talk to young people, on boards, etc. I mean, I like that intergenerational dialogue, but we do not have enough of that. I actually believe that a lot of this history has to be put down someplace in order that future generations will be able to understand it better. I have to praise City Lore because they have taken on the documentation and exhibition and building a touring exhibition about the CETA Artist Project. We have initiatives where the stories have to be told.
And New York Historical Society does a great job.
There's just and this is the issue of artist legacies is critically important. There's a generation of work that many on this call have been part of bringing into being that is at risk because the system for capturing artist legacies is very limited. It's a kind of pay-to-play system. It's not one that embraces the new voices that we've tried to bring into being. And we've got to come up with a way. It's an acute problem in New York City because we have so many artists who are aging, and we need to get their stories better understood and told somehow. This is there are some people working on this, but it's a cross-generational effort. We can't do it alone.
This is a perfect time to put the pause button on, and with this notion that what's a conversation amongst us has to be replicated over and over and over in lots of living rooms, in lots of dining rooms, in lots of classrooms, so that a sizable population begins to be heard for the first time by a whole new set of residents in our cities. So we hope that with the technology at hand, more conversations like this will give birth to more action, and so that people like Jill and the Clark Center continue to function and don't have to ask, is it possible that we can? That'll be a given. We must. So
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Clark Center. Thank you, Jill. Clark Center, New York is really, really dealing with the legacy issue and the generational crossover. I urge you to support it however you can. And I think people can make donations, Jill, through.
Well, they can make a donation on the Eventbrite page. There's a link to donate. Our website is under reconstruction right now, but
Okay.
should be up and running in a week or two.
Right.
So stay tuned and tune into our Facebook page, Remembering Clark Center, for updates on that. Thank you so much, Ted and Carol.
Thank you.
this has
Thank
been
you. And thank you
so
all
special.
for celebrating my Jubilee year with me.
Well, Ted, I just have to say, I guess it was lucky that the Shoemaker wasn't successful, although I did suggest that you might be able to bring it back now to great reviews, but we all
We got good
benefited
reviews.
from that.
It's some production.
let's
Not at the Orpheum Theater, but we got
Oh.
good reviews.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, and stay tuned for more events from Clark Center.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.